Hey, good morning. This is Cam Corder with another episode of the Quarantine Series, and I'm joined by four great friends. I'm going to introduce them. First is Terry Matthews. She's had a 25-year career in the Y, even though she looks so young, and she's with the YMCAs of Northwest North Carolina.
Good morning.
Bottom corner is Parrish Underwood. Parrish is the Chief Advancement Officer with the YMCAs in Atlanta, Greater Atlanta. And Parrish has been with the YMCA 28 years. And top is Carolyn Krieger, and she's been one of my coaches and mentors in my career. She's retired from the Y as the National Director of Multicultural Leadership. And she's been to Cleveland County and spent a day or two with my Y, and it's just been a great friend and mentor. And then the bottom left is almost like my father. He's had a 52-year Y career, and Norm Joyner has been really important to me in my career, and just in our friendship and being here and coaching me as a leader and being honest with me, and then laughing a lot. We spent a lot of time laughing. He retired 20 years ago probably, but he still, as we joked before I hit record, he's still involved in a lot of interim opportunities with the YMCA. I'm grateful for you great friends joining us, and just sharing with the Y movement your hearts and passions. But Norm, I'll start with you. That in your 52-year Y career, you've seen so much. You've seen so much civil unrest. Is today different? And kind of why or why not?
Thanks, Cam. First of all, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share, some things that I have experienced and to be a part of this group. Let me just start out by saying there are some differences, between what's going on now and what took place, and I would say 1967. And I want to start with that. I'm sure that Carolyn can go back to, maybe I shouldn't say that, go back to 1967. But I never forget that I finished college at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina in June of 1967. And I had to go to summer school. And that I got a call to interview for my first YMCA job in Montclair, New Jersey. My first opportunity to fly on a plane. And my interview was on that first Friday in August. Some of you can put the dots together. That was the weekend that the Newark riots began. August 1967. So I'm trying to connect the dots so I can express what I want to express. And that that next Friday, I got a call from the Montclair YMCA executive director offering me the job. And you always think, God is always, guiding you and preparing you. And I wonder if I would have gotten that job if it had not been for what was going on in Newark, New Jersey, the first weekend and the first week in 1967. I became the first African-American to work as an exempt staff at the Montclair YMCA as the third health and PE director. And so I just want to just share that, and the rest is history. We might talk a little bit more a little bit later on. And I want to share with you what I see as the difference. There are 2 points I want to share, and you probably already have heard this before. I think the biggest difference between the uprisings or the protests around injustice and racial equality, one is that there are more young people involved, more young people. And I compare that, and I've had some conversation with some of my other friends around the world, especially in South Africa, and again, you do your history, is that in 1976, in 1994, when apartheid was overthrown, if you can remember, there was more youth involved during that time. and all of those uprisings. And they also identify that as the youth uprising, along with the uprising of Black South Africans. That reminds me of what's going on right now because of the dynamics and the diversity around youth. Because in '67, you can almost remember who was on the front line of all and most protests. It was older folks. It was folks that were from prominent areas within a community, or from the African American community. You can almost identify who they were. Today, you see all these youth, which I think is fantastic, because it's their future. It's their future. It's the same thing that was said about the youth in South Africa that was involved in those uprisings. The other difference is that it is definitely more diverse, way more diverse in terms of race, color, creed, and whatever than it was in 1967. So I would open up by just sharing that with you and just give you just one little 60-second tidbit about how this police brutality against African-American males in particular, definitely in terms of Blacks in particular. I was born in LaGrange, North Carolina, a town of 2,600 people, 26, and I'm kind of stretching it. I was 7 years old. This would have been 1952. Had a cousin that was 12, and we were coming home from our church youth choir practice on a Wednesday night. I lived on one side of town and he lived on another side of town. Before he got home, he was shot 16 times. And his body was dragged to the side of a white person's home. And of course, no cameras, no one can dispute. And they identified the reason they shot him was because he was peeping in a window. Now, when you were raised, and I was raised in LaGrange, North Carolina, your parents tell you where you should not go and where you can go. And so that story, and it's documented, until a few years ago, the narrative changed to the narrative of what we are seeing today. So that sticks with me for just about all of my life. 60-some years has passed since that happened. So I just want to just share that with you and identify one around the police brutality and how we get treated and looked upon. But my cousin got drugged in a community on the side of town that you would never set foot in. I didn't. And then to have him shot 16 times, and my grandfather, was an undertaker. And we had a picture that shows all the bullet holes. And of course, I didn't see that then, I saw that later in life. It makes you then can connect the dots in terms of what's been going on in our community. So I'll stop there, Cam. But I think to answer your question, I want to just point those two differences out first and just kind of put a personal touch into where my feelings are in terms of what has happened to in my family directly. So I just stopped there.
Great. No, I knew you'd offer a great historical perspective. Carolyn, do you feel it's different today than maybe protests in the last 20 years?
I do.
I say that. My question would be, I worry that the protest and our history has been, we'll protest for a couple of weeks and then something else will happen and we'll move on to the next, and it won't fester back up until the next. But is the day different? Does it have traction?
Well, so being quarantined, what I've seen on TV, it does look like it has traction. I think that what's different is that business people are the sports franchises, that there are changes that are being made that are very public and very significant. That's going to be impossible for them to walk back from. So that's what I see that's different. We've had protests over the decades, and I don't know if Norm feels this way. And by the way, Norm, I was graduating from high school in 1967. But over the decades, you know, someone gets killed in an absolutely outrageous way, where everyone is witnessing it, you know, bursting into someone's home while they're sleeping. You know, there's so many examples. So young people do take to the streets. They took to the streets when I was young. I took to the streets when I was young. But what I see that's different is that the leaders in this country are saying it's our responsibility to make changes in our organization, that Black people and all people of color, we are the result, or we are the, I hate the word victim, but we are what happens when those in power do not adhere to social justice. And so that's where the changes have to be. And that's what I'm seeing. Yesterday, Serena Williams' husband was on one of the morning shows, and he is giving up his seat on his own company with the desire that that seat be filled by an African American. So I do see that our leaders are taking specific actions, even within the Y. I'm going to call out Steve Ives. You know, he's written very powerful on this topic, as have others, and that's what we need to see. And we didn't see that before. You know, we kept waiting for, well, what is the Y's position on this? And now you're seeing these CEOs take courageous steps to say that, to call out the social injustice. That's what I see that's different.
Right. Parrish, how's the Atlanta YMCA responded, or how you been affected by protests in and around Atlanta?
You know, it's interesting, and I appreciate the question, particularly being in Atlanta, which is, you know, many people are regarded as the cradle of civil rights, coming out of the 50s and 60s. And so that atmosphere remains very much alive. And at the point of the protesting and the uprising following the George Floyd murder, and if you spoke with anyone, you know, there's a sense that here we are again, having to stand up for ourselves and having to fight for just common basic human rights. It changed a little bit because the behavior of the police in some instances really sort of colored it a bit, if you will. But in terms of the Y's role and what's happened, we were shifting fairly rapidly based on some crisis relief programs as a result of COVID. You know, the coronavirus hit. We, just like many Y's, had shifted into providing services around basic human needs for people who absolutely were in need, such as child care programs for emergency responders and frontline workers, and food insecurity for those families who depend on the school system for their meals. And so, you know, and it felt really, really, really good because we were moving away from the retail side of the Y, which is membership, because, you know, all of our Y's were closed. And we were beginning to get very, very, very comfortable with people's perceptions of seeing the Y as and this is for lack of a better term, a true nonprofit, a nonprofit that focuses on human needs, the human factor. And so as the protesting and the incidents really just around the country, you got to remember Brunswick, Georgia, where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered for running, for jogging. He's literally chasing down, hunted down. That's a short drive from Atlanta, Georgia. And so that was fairly a prominent conversation in our atmosphere. And we were already beginning to think, how can we utilize our strengths around being an agency, an organization that has great convening power to begin to broker these conversations around race and diversity and inclusion and just common decency of treating one another. And so at the point in time when the protest began to take place and eventually turned into riots, we've sort of been thrust into the forefront and asking ourselves the question, internally and externally, what role can the YMCA play to broker these relationships? We've been serving the broader Atlanta community for 162 years, and fundamentally our mission has not changed. And we've played a role during the civil rights movement as a location, spillover location for meeting, particularly when the churches were filled to capacity or otherwise. And many of our city's leadership at that time and currently have always been engaged with the YMCA. And so we know that we have a role to play. We're exploring the conversations around equity. Earlier this morning, we had a very rich conversation with a group in Twin Cities, who you all know has created an equity center. So it's very, very refreshing to see us sort of fill in a gap and step up and fill a role that is quite natural to us just because of our history in the community. I do want to, not to belabor the point, but I want to relay back to what Carolyn and Norm said around what's different. You know, the youth movement has always been a cataclysmic point of change I mean, going back through the history of time. Norm is absolutely right. I've spent a great deal of time with him in South Africa. And so we know the impact of the youth movement on apartheid, but it's the same here. You know, I think now I wasn't born in 1967. I came a few years later in 1970, but because of my grandparents and my parents, you know, they talked, and still to this day, very intimately and profoundly about what those years meant. And so you grow up, and we came up feeling as if we lived through that era. But, you know, it wasn't until the firemen and the policemen turned those fire hoses on those students in Birmingham, Alabama in the 60s that this became of national prominence in a sense. And so youth are the cataclysmic linchpin that makes this work. And today's youth is very interested because they're a little bit more distant from sort of the oral tradition of the civil rights movement, because they're you know, we're now 40, 50 years outside of that. And with the advent of the smartphone and the 24-hour news cycle that keeps these instances, this evidence front and center, it is really, really, really difficult for anyone to sit still and sit complacent. You're compelled to act. And I praise God for the energy of that's coming out from these younger people, because I think they're going to be the ones that make it all work. Just like the youth and yesteryears. It's different now because of those other factors. And then Norm is absolutely right. It's not just African Americans, it's people of all backgrounds. And it relates solely to just human decency, of treating people fairly. And it's good to see that people get it. Our young people get it. And so I'm betting on them more than I am on the systemic processes. Even though we know that they've been here around, they continue to fester, but all of a sudden we're pulling the Band-Aid off, we're ripping the Band-Aid off and exposing it to everyone. And I think we're going to be fine as long as we support them, we lead and follow at the same time, and let their energy prevail. So I'll stop there because I can.
Terry, how do you want, and how do other mid-level managers, what are you expecting from your leaders today around this topic?
You're referring to around the racism and,
yeah.
Well, I guess I would say as a leader, especially like yourself, Cam, you have the privilege of being Caucasian and male. And I think that if you use your privilege to really sit at tables where there are staff of color and middle management or even entry level management, and you sit with us and listen and also think of us as an opportunity to possibly continue someone's journey through the YMCA. When you show up at a conference, instead of spending time, and I'm not throwing stones at you, please don't think so, but instead of using that as a time for you to convene with the other CEOs and, you know, reminisce, use it as a time to really meet young staff and feel kind of what they're feeling and see what they aspire to be and how you can help them in that journey. And then collect their business cards. And then as you have opportunities come up, or as your cohort of CEOs have opportunities come up, go back in your mind to those conferences that you've been at and reflect on the staff that you've met. And if there's some staff of color that could possibly fit into some of those seats, use your seat of privilege and the tables that you sit at to give us those opportunities. I think there's just so much wealth of knowledge that young people of color, all people have, but you could use your seat to really make a difference. And then people can see the YMCA as a career because they'll start to see people of color in seats that are different from where they sit right now.
Yeah. Carolyn, so white CEO, small Southern town, but it could be any YMCA in America. What are you looking for from me as the leader of that YMCA around this issue?
What I'm looking for and what I'm pleased to see in many instances is be the voice of reason and support and understanding of what staff of color are going through, you know, what staff of color are not given opportunities, you know, and be aware of your surroundings. So we all probably can say that oftentimes when we're in the room with leaders, we may be the only person of color. And we notice it. We always notice it. You know, it is an automatic response that when we go into a meeting or a room where there are people in power positions, who else is there that looks like me? And until recently in the Y, there might be one. And you look around the room and, you know, you're it. So what I would love to see from you and other leaders, Caucasian leaders within the Y, is that you become more cognizant of who's in the room. And even more importantly, who is not in the room, and speak up and question and say, what's wrong with this picture? And, you know, I think that we need to do something about this. And so what's the plan? And move that towards action. That's really, really powerful. And I'll give you just a quick non-YMCA example of that. My best friend of many, many years is white, and she and I were in New Orleans, and I believe that's where we were. And I went in, and we both went into the little hotel convenience store to get something, and I paid for my product, whatever it was, and walked out and was standing outside the store. And then my friend went up to pay for hers, and the clerk said to her, "I just hate those people." And my friend said, "Who are you talking about?" And she said, you know, like that colored woman that just left. And Trudy said, "How on earth can you talk about people like that? That is my sister." And so to speak when we're not present is really, really important. And that's what I would want to see from you.
Awesome. That's great.
Kim, could I follow up on something, please?
Sure.
Something that Carolyn said earlier. You asked the question, you know, what do we see moving forward? I'm of the mindset that my cup is always 80% full, you know, so I'm from a positive point of view. And I think that in the past, when we've had protests and when we've had these types of activities, is that it was more located within a state or in a country. This is worldwide.
Yeah.
So it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And that, and I think the world is going to make sure it doesn't go away. And it's focused on us right now just because of all of what's taking place. But there'll be others not only looking, but supporting. So I don't see this as a trend that just lasts for a few weeks or a few months. So I want to just point that out.
Yeah, that's a great
Back
point.
on Carolyn's point about what folks needs to do, and folks, I'm talking about why folks now in terms of CEOs. It's an uncomfortable conversation. Well, to me, that's a positive. It's got to be uncomfortable. I mean, if you don't think it's going to be uncomfortable, then you're not thinking realistically. But as a leader,
let me ask you a question around that. You've been interim at many small towns and throughout your career. So how would you coach the CEO that's bored and maybe even community and staff are resistant to this discussion and dialogue? Coach us through that.
I think it's repetition. I think that you got to speak to the point, not just once. I think you got to start within the YMCA, your personal commitment, your personal support, to your staff. I mean, you got to look at your staff when you're sitting around in that room, as Carolyn said, and also look who's not there when you already identify what the topic is going to be. Who's not there, because that's going to give you an idea of who's going to be supportive and how you're going to have to work or deal with that particular person. But I think you got to begin to have conversation on this topic, and you can't dance around it. I mean, you got to have the conversation, and the same thing with your board. You have to have the same kind. You got to take some time to do that. And so I think that's part of the plan, starting internally with your staff and with your board, and then you can go out. But I think that's a start. I mean, that's not the only thing you can do. I'm just saying internally, if I was doing an interim, I mean, it would have been the first conversation, the first topic that we would have dealt with in our next staff meeting or in our first board meeting. But see, I'm an African-American. I can do that. I'm comfortable in doing that. You got to be comfortable. Others got to be comfortable that are from the other side, So I know you can be comfortable, Cam, but who else can be comfortable? But they got to do it.
Challenge I've heard from my peers in the past, not around this case, that I hate to say excuse, but my board's not ready for that discussion yet. We're not ready for that discussion. And to brag on my board, is my staff and board are getting ready to go through this. We start next week. Book came in yesterday, and this morning I was driving around and delivering them. But we have kind of a mixture of some board members and staff that are going to go through that book and have that discussion.
Cam, if I could
Sure.
make one point about going through that book and those uncomfortable spaces where the conversation is being had. One of the things that that enlightened equity leaders can do on our behalf, if we're not in the room, is that we live in the uncomfortable spaces 24 hours a day, 7 days a week,
Yes.
for our entire lives. And so when you get to a certain age, perhaps, or when you just get tired, sick and tired of being sick and tired, I've changed my Facebook profile to say that because I keep seeing it over and over again. Just try to understand that where the conversation you are entering and the space that you are entering is uncomfortable for you and others. We live in that space all of the time.
Yeah, that's very impactful. Thanks for saying that. Paris, you're with a large organization, one of the largest Ys in the country, but how would you coach a mid-level leader, African-American leader, who their boss is resistant to this discussion, or even their organization, their Ys may be resistant to this discussion? How would you coach them to have a voice?
That's a very interesting question, and I think in today's time it's very difficult for anyone to suppress their voice. You have to understand the energy that is upon us. Even the most disciplined are going to be challenged to be non-reactive, because as Carolyn said, you get to a point where you just don't have strength to hold it in after a while, to hear comments, and we hear it all the time, the board is not ready for this or whatever. And you say, well, this is 2020. And we've been hearing the same thing for forever, if you will. I think if you have to kind of walk the talk, if you will, and challenge people's personal perceptions. I think oftentimes when you hear that, it's because there's a lack of context on a specific demographic of people. African Americans and other ethnic groups are not monolithic. There's diversity within that group. That's just absolutely beautiful. And if people are resistant or are challenged to open their minds and eyes to it, they're indeed missing out on the beauty and the strength that can be added to an organization. I'll give a quick example, and I hope this sort of drives my point. I've managed 5 branches, and 3 of them were in affluent, traditional white communities, if you will. And so even though I'm an African American, most of my experience has not been in African American communities, although I draw a great deal of strength from those experiences. But when I arrived in a new community, new city, new state, people will ask, oh, so where are you from? Now, I'm a proud Southsider from Chicago. I mean, absolutely proud, born and raised. If I can live there right now, trust me, I would. And I said, well, I'm from Chicago. And of course, the next question is, oh yeah, where about, what part of town? And I would say South Side. Mm-hmm. And the looks on their faces were just I couldn't figure out if they were just either scared or fearful, or, it was almost like, oh my gosh, you poor soul. And the kind of pride I have, I had to begin to push back, because the South Side of Chicago is a very large geographic footprint. There are places on the north side of Chicago, which they probably are more familiar with, that I would not be caught dead in during the day. What I realized is that those individuals lacked context. Many of them had not been in the city limits of their own time, their own spaces. And if they had, it was probably for some pro event. And at that point in time, I realized the lack of context that people have, or wherever they get their context from, is really what holds them back, if you will. And so I've been able to have some level of success because I've been able to challenge those perspectives or those prejudices based on how I show up and how I speak and how I move about. And if you can get people to sort of help them go through those experiences and break down those barriers and walls, 9 times out of 10, they're going to have success. I have to look at everyone as being inherently good. It is much heavier of a burden for me to think that people naturally hate you, even though that is the fact for some. But I'm going to struggle going about if I have to have some kind of ongoing competition with you, trying to help you appreciate who I am. And so I would rather show you than tell you. And from that experience, that has been helpful for me. That won't be everyone's experience, because you just can't save them all, or you can't get people to open their minds. But this is 2020. We've experienced that we can be in leadership positions, and we're human. Our history states that we're less violent than other cultures, other races. And so whatever fear it is, I question that. And so I don't know if I've answered the question.
But that's great comments. I appreciate, we put out our statement. I put out my statement, but I challenged my team that I said what you were saying at the end. Our actions need to speak much louder than our words. We can say what we want to say, but we need to act, walk the talk, you know, kind of thing. Terry, how would you coach your peers to find a voice in this discussion?
Well, one thing I would challenge people to do is find your allies, because sometimes even when you're at a table, your voice is still not heard. And so if your ally can advocate for your voice, sometimes I can say something and it's heard differently when it comes from someone who looks different than I do. So not only do you want them to advocate for you, but bring your voice back around into the table. It's like, I hear Terry saying that, and let's hear a little bit more about that, Terry. So you use your seat as an ally to bring my voice back into the conversation, because sometimes we can be negated as marginalized people. Sometimes our voice just is not heard the same way that your voice is.
Yeah. Norm,
If I can
Sure.
speak to that for a second, Terry, you are so dead on or spot on with that. Before I joined the Y, and one of my other jobs, I was on a small team, and I was the only person of color, and I was the only female, and we had a huge job to do. And but we were together in a small room and traveling around our company's property for, I think it was 3 months. And so having conversations with these white men who are all in positions of power, it made them see things differently. And I said that I can be in the room exactly as you said and say something, and it will just go, there will be absolute silence. Yep. And people will act as if, you know, I didn't say anything. And you can turn around and say the same thing and it will be heard. And so I got them to practice that and in meetings, and they would actually then say, okay, now, you know, Carolyn said that just like 3 minutes ago and no one reacted at all. And there would be the opportunity, a learning moment or a teaching moment. And anyway, so it just woke something up in me because that is so true. And that has as much to do, I believe, with being a female as it does to being a person of color.
And we'll do another call, another quarantine series just about female leadership. We'll get you both back. Norm, 52 years. You've seen a lot of cultural and just differences, and you've been an inspiration in how you lead. But you're talking to the 25-year-old entry-level program director today, African American. Is the Y a good career for them to stay the next 30, 40 years?
Yes. You know, I would be hypocritical if I didn't believe that this organization, in terms of who we are and in terms of our mission and the things and the services and the programs that we can provide, especially to young people. If I said no, Kim, that would not be me. You know, I think there are challenges. Matter of fact, I know there are challenges that are facing us that we have to do to make it a career, offering to young people that let them know that they can make a difference in the lives of folks and in the lives of folks in communities, in the broader community as well as in the narrow community. So the answer to your question, even to the day, what I do is because I believe in who we are in terms of our mission. To me now, that comes first and foremost, and how we can make a difference in the lives of individuals in all communities, especially in our community, because I grew up, didn't even know anything about a YMCA at all. When I came to work for the Y, when I set foot the first time in that Montclair YMCA, I didn't even know what the YMCA meant. I just knew it was the YMCA. You know, so I just want to be emphatic about that, because that's the way I believe. And a lot of that is based on, you know, the tenure and the time that I have spent in this Y movement and the people that I've met and the people that we have touched, you know, to say, yes, this is an opportunity for African Americans. But we got to make sure, and I'm sure Carolyn can speak to this, we got to make sure that we share that message in a way that's positive and that's also doable. That's part of our task. So how do we make it show to young folks that this is something that you really want to get involved in, other than just coming to work? It's something that you can make a difference in the lives of folks and the lives of families and the communities that you serve.
Well, and lift up guys like Parrish, who's in C-suite, you know, and we got some great role models across the country, African-American executives. And so the opportunity to take more young people, Parrish, that's an awesome responsibility for you to be that role model. Carolyn, what about for the 25-year-old female? Is the Y a good career track?
Yes, yes. There are, but I will be very truthful, and there are some associations that are better than others in recognizing the talent of women and of people of color. When we were doing, when I was doing the multicultural leadership development work, and that work was around helping staff of color move into C-suite positions, you know, frankly, there were, and it was all about leadership. There were YMCAs that we would say, if you go there, you will be stuck. You know, they will see you as being able to only do one thing. And usually that's running the Y that's in the urban community. There are other associations that have equity leaders, what we would call allies or enlightened leaders, who will say, you know, if you come to my YMCA, I will help you with your career. So you want to have those conversations, and you want to be willing to relocate to pursue those opportunities. So Cam, if you have a young program director and maybe you don't have a branch open, an opportunity for them, I would say that you as that equity leader would say, okay, I see you're ready, you're itching, you know, to take on more responsibility. Let me help you find that job. What can I do to help? What can I do to support? So that just comes to my mind, but there are any number of things that young people can do. And what I'm so proud of is that they are finding their voice, and they are speaking their truth. And if they're not finding the opportunities within their own organization, they are moving to other organizations, hopefully within the movement, where they can be recognized for the talent that they have.
Cam,
This is shared to many people. And so people are listening. Give us as we wrap up, the 30, 45 second, what's your hopes and dreams for the Y movement? Not just your Y, but for the Y movement as it relates to race. And I'll just let y'all jump in as you please.
I'll start. I think as we're looking at programs and our opportunity to touch so many lives through the programs and services that we offer, that we use the opportunity to enlighten young people and make them aware and help them to develop as racial equity people. Just, you know, people who truly love people. I think about the Black and Latino Achievers programs. I think about our little children in summer day camp. How are we educating them that everybody is everybody and love is love? And we just want you to be part of the big global picture of just awesomeness. And I don't know any other way to say it, but I just think the Y brings people together innately. That's just what we do. But what we use that time that we have the people with, that's what we need to make very intentional choices around how we're educating people during the time that we have them.
Right. Parrish, what are your thoughts?
I'm going to echo Terry in that regard and take it a step further. I'm hopeful that we will become attentive listeners and engage our young people in a manner that allows them to sort of drive us to becoming the organization that's most relevant for them and for how they grow and how they will need to lead in the future. And, you know, I want to continue to promote the strength of the youth movement, but I'd be remiss if I did not, and thank you, Carolyn, for spawning this idea. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and say the same about the women in our movement. I mean, they are the strongest, and they are sort of taking a no holds barred approach. And quite honestly, that's always been the case. Even if you go back to any movement or the civil rights movement, they were always the energy and the force, and they're on the front lines taking leadership roles and leading us along the way. And I would like to see us embrace that from an organization standpoint, to harness that leadership capacity, that energy, and really just the spirit of what they bring to the table. And so I think we will find ourselves in a great position if we support our youth movement and also our the movement around women leadership.
Alan, what are your thoughts?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh,
What's your hopes and dreams for the YMCA in the future?
you know, so my hopes and dreams are coming true. I see it every day with technology, and that is, I want to see more leaders of color or more people of color in leadership positions. I retired from the Y the year that Alabama, which our CEOs and African-American community said that we would never have a CEO in the Deep South. And I retired after within 6 months when a young man from our program, the Multicultural Executive Development Institute, when he successfully became the CEO in Birmingham, Alabama. And 6 months later, another graduate of our program became the CEO of Montgomery. So the two largest YMCAs in the state of Alabama were led by African-American males. So my dream and my hopes and aspirations for the Y are being realized every day. And I want to see that continue. And these people that are leading the Y, they've found their voices. They will not be silenced. And that's what I hoped for. People like Norm and I would say that I was your voice in places where you didn't have a voice. Well, now they have a voice and they're using it, and they'll make the YMCA and the country much, much better.
Great. Norm, what's your hope for the Y? Unless you can work another 40 years.
I want to kind of piggyback on what Carolyn just said. And mine's around African Americans of color in leadership roles. I remember when I began in the Y, I probably knew just about every African American that was in the health and PE field. I probably knew every African American that was a CEO or an executive, because there weren't many CEOs back in that time. I knew them by name that I could call. And so we've come a long ways. But at the same time, you know, I think moving forward, we have to have a presence on higher institutions that where African Americans matriculate, and identify some of those African Americans and identify this is a space, the YMCA, where they can make a career. I think we've lost that a little bit. You know, I don't think we go on those campuses anymore. Let me back up. We don't go on those campuses as much as we should go on those campuses. And we need to make a larger presence than what we've made in the past. I think that would help us to help identify potential leaders, you know, that could come to the YMCA. And I think we're kind of backed off of that a little bit. But I think that the opportunity is there. And I think if we can get more African Americans or folks of color to take a look at, who we are as an organization, how we can make a difference in the lives of folks in our communities and the community at large, then that is my hope, because it's one thing when I look at the Atlantas, the Charlottes, the Triangle YMCAs, the New Yorks, the Chicagos, but there's a lot of mid-sized YMCAs, even though Terry, where you are, that's an example, that's a positive example. There are others that don't have this balance. I don't have this percentage. I don't have, African Americans or folks of colors that I think that they should be trying to encourage to become part of this staff and to have mentors that can help them, go through this movement and advance through this movement. So that's my hope. I said a lot on that, but that's my hope.
I'm thankful for the relationship I have with all four of you. I appreciate the time. I hope if somebody's watching this, that they spend the time to take a few notes and enlighten themselves and to share it. And I hope that as an organization that, especially where the discussion's even more difficult, that we're brave enough to just take a step and follow some of the great advice that y'all have given. But I'm thankful for your time and your leadership and your voice and making our communities better. So, and we are better together, and that's a great hashtag, and we got to believe it and live it every day. So thank you. And if you're watching this, please share it and look for future episodes. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.